Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for March 26, 2021. It's Friday, so I'm going to take some questions, but I just want to begin with informing you that we are circulating a resolution on changing China policy. It's getting signatures from experts on China to counter the line of China as a threat to the West, the need for a military expansion and a military alliance to counter and contain them. This is available for you to look at the Schiller Institute website. The resolution is being circulated. There are more than 30 China experts who have signed it so far. And to back it up, I have written an article which will be posted on my blog page by the end of the weekend on what's behind the anti-China policy that's come out of the Biden administration so far. So I'd urge you to read my article, look at the resolution, and go out and organize people to understand how they're being manipulated by the same people who are pushing the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. And the same people who ran Russiagate, who are now trying to convince the American people that China's our enemy and we must combat them with every means possible. So take a look at that, and that gets me to my first question. You recently said Biden's policy on China is a continuation of Trump's policy. How is that? Well, look at the difference between Donald Trump in his first 3 years and the last year on China. When he came in, the China issue was still not fully resolved, whether he was seeking the same kind of cooperation that he was with Putin. But after his first meeting with Xi Jinping, he became effusive in praising Xi. After his trip to China, he was talking about the greatness of China's infrastructure and how this could be a lesson for the United States, and the importance of a collaborative relationship which brought about the openings toward North Korea, which unfortunately were sabotaged by representatives of the military-industrial complex, including John Bolton. That Trump was moving toward a denuclearization potential, and it was undermined by Bolton's threats to Kim Jong-un. But Trump maintained a commitment to talking about working with China. There was the Phase 1 trade agreement, which was an attempt to reverse the problems of the Bush and Obama trade agreements that led to a huge trade imbalance between the United States and China. They were moving toward a Phase 2. When COVID first hit, President Trump praised China for its preemptive actions to contain the virus. Now, what happened? Well, as it spread into the United States, he was convinced to blame it on China, as opposed to what he said earlier, which is that the devastation to public health of privatization, of austerity, and Obamacare left the United States unprepared. Instead, it was blamed on China. This opened the door for the war hawk Secretary of State Pompeo to launch a world tour to rally the world against China, to call for sanctions, to call for expanding military expenditures, to have an Asian NATO and a NATO deployment into the Indo-Pacific region. Pompeo's statements against China are echoed in the recent comments by Secretary of State Blinken, Biden's Secretary of State, and Jake Sullivan with their encounter with Chinese foreign ministry officials in Alaska. That's what I was referring to. This is a very dangerous direction and needs to be reversed immediately, because the Pompeo policy and the current Biden policy, there's very little difference between them, although the Biden people are saying we don't want a new Cold War. And yet, in effect, that's what's being organized. And that's what the works from the Council on Foreign Relations, the Atlantic Council, the Center for New American Security, all of them are oriented toward a new Cold War and a military buildup against China. Now, the second question was, what's behind the recent vacillation on the coronavirus policy of Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor? Well, what happened is there was a meeting last week, and Merkel and the Council of Ministers, the state presidents of all the German states, decided to have an extended lockdown until toward the end of April. But right around Easter, the week of Easter, April 1st to April 5th, a total shutdown of Germany with the exception of one day when you could get groceries. Now, there was a reaction against this, but it wasn't just against the specifics of the lockdown. It was the reaction against the inconsistency of the policy and the complete botch job that was done of the vaccination policy. That what Merkel did was cede to the European Union the power to decide how much vaccine should be purchased, how to distribute it, and this was completely sabotaged by the president of Europe, Ursula von der Leyen, a Merkel appointee, who decided to let the EU have complete control of this so as to increase European solidarity. Well, this was solidarity of the grave. It wasn't a serious effort. It wasn't a serious policy. And as a result, Germany is far behind much of the rest of the advanced sector in terms of vaccinations. And now with the third wave hitting Europe, with an increase in deaths, with a overflow at many of the hospitals, exhaustion of doctors and medical professionals, almost 1/3 of Germany's medical professionals have quit in the last year. So under these circumstances, as well as the anger about the effects of the lockdown on small business, the disruption of life overall, especially because it's been inconsistent and not effective, all of this caused Merkel to reverse her decision, to take the blame for it and say that there would not be this extreme lockdown between April 1st and April 5th. It remains to be seen if the European Union can recover from the public relations disaster with the vaccines, but the problem is the EU is a completely phony entity to start with. And if Germany really wishes to revive its real economy and its position in the world, Germany should leave the European Union. Now, there are two questions about organizing. The first one was basically, how can we build a recognition of the coherence between New Deal economics, or American system economics, and the pursuit of peace? And this is from my friend Steve out on the West Coast. Now, the obvious point here is that the so-called progressive movement in the United States has turned into a complete reversal of its traditional policies. Progressives used to be for building. They used to be for infrastructure. They used to be for a foreign policy based on seeking peace and cooperation, not war. And in terms of domestic policy, they completely opposed the FBI and its police state methods, and they also opposed the CIA and its regime change. This is completely flipped. The Democrats today have joined most of the Republicans as a war party, committed to the wars, committed to neoliberal economics, austerity, free trade, globalization, and so on, with all the disasters that's led to. And so the question then really is, and I'm interpreting this for Steve, but how do we create an alliance between those people who consider themselves conservatives and see war as a disaster for the country, as well as rejecting neoliberal economics, and the Democrats who still have an opposition to Wall Street and globalization? That's the issue. The common ground here is that the United States should return to its American system economic policies, which means investment in infrastructure. How can that be controversial? How can Republicans and Democrats not find an agreement to rebuild the crumbling roads and the decrepit airports and the declining waterways and so on? We need that as an urgent necessity. At the same time, that's the part of the United States which makes us powerful by improving our economic capability, our physical economy, which then puts us in a position where we don't have to fear potential alliances or disagreements around the world, where we have a strong economy, a strong dollar, and can lead the world in the pursuit of economic cooperation for peaceful development. So that's the coherence. There's no essential distinction between economic development and peace. In fact, that was key with Roosevelt. It was key with Eisenhower. It was key with John Kennedy. This is what Reagan meant by peace through strength. He didn't mean we want to have a complete buildup militarily. He meant the military buildup serves the purpose of encouraging peaceful cooperation. So I would say that's the best way to answer the question. The final question is, how do you approach complex issues such as countering anti-nuclear propaganda? Now, I think this is a more complicated one, and I'm just going to give a couple of hints to it. But I think you have to look at the fact that the issue of science has long been a controversial one, going back to the fights between the Aristotelians and their empirical approach versus the Platonists, Plato himself, who put forward an idea of hypothesis as the means by which you approach scientific truth. With the Aristotelians, opinion is part of it because you have an opinion of what you see, what you experience with the senses, as opposed to Plato, who realized that since you can't see physical processes, you have to imagine and work on a hypothesis as to what's going on. Now, instead, we have people who are divided based on profiles. You have so-called liberals who are fearful of nuclear proliferation, who don't know the difference between nuclear bombs and a nuclear power plant. And that's, of course, not accidental. This was part of a major propaganda campaign by so-called environmentalists on behalf of population reduction to convince people that pursuing more modern science and technology will result in a rapid depletion of raw materials and plunge the world into barbaric competition over those scarce raw materials. But real science is based on creative discovery, which enables us to increase the potential of resources available to us. Coal and oil were not resources for the cavemen. However, by developing scientific advances, such as the internal combustion engine, we were able to find a use for these things. The idea of coal is another example. There are processes, higher temperature burning processes, which are essentially clean coal, which do not produce the kind of pollution that we're accustomed to from the old Bessemer process in Pittsburgh in the 19th century, or what we saw in Eastern Europe or even China. China is moving toward 50% of its electricity being produced from coal and 50% nuclear. Why are the Chinese not scared of nuclear technology? Well, part of what was done was to use things such as 3 Mile Island and then Fukushima to say that nuclear power is inherently dangerous, we have no solution for the waste. There are things you can read about this. In fact, the Fusion Energy Foundation, which is no longer in existence, but it published a number of articles over the years about nuclear technology and how the waste issue is a fraudulent one. One of the ways to deal with the waste issue is reprocessing, which was shut down in the United States by Jimmy Carter. We've had an opportunity to develop nuclear fusion where we're always told it's 20 to 30 years away. Why is that? Because it's never funded. And now because of the Chinese, because of the ITER project, the inter-European project on it, and even advances in U.S. research centers, we're now approaching a point at which nuclear fusion can become the almost inexhaustible, clean, safe energy source of the future. So I would suggest that you look at this question from the standpoint of real science. The fact is that there are unstable capabilities in any system. You know, in a totally wood, a city of wood buildings, fire becomes an existential problem. But it's man's ability of making creative discovery so that we can harness the power of nature that's there. Fusion is what powers the sun. Without fusion power, we wouldn't exist. So the point is that there are irrationalities that were introduced deliberately, going back to the population bomb, the Silent Spring, the Earth Day, the creation of Earth Day almost 50 years ago, that were designed to scare people into accepting the idea that we have to lower our standards of living, We have to go back to less energy dense forms of energy production, and therefore that mankind cannot exist with 7 billion people on the planet. We have to go back to 3 or 2 or even 1 billion people. And that's what the whole Green New Deal is about. So I think on the one hand, study who created these scare stories about nuclear energy and so on. And then secondly, do a little investigation of your own into the science and realize that a nuclear power plant is not a nuclear bomb. So there's a lot more that we could say on that. I would also urge people to look at the really excellent presentation by Dr. William Happer at last weekend's Schiller Institute conference on the fraud of carbon dioxide as another example. All of a sudden, everyone's freaked out about carbon and carbon-based energy. But we're carbon-based. Human beings produce carbon dioxide. Are we the enemies of the planet? Well, according to Greta Thunberg and John Kerry and others, yes, we are. So if you accept that, then there's no excuse except to leave, go somewhere else, wherever you can get away from breathing. But the reality is very different. And this is why there's a question of real science versus science fiction and empiricism. And one of the key questions to look at in that is the role of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz with his concept of power and dynamics. Because Leibniz investigated these questions of what is the actual nature of man? How does creativity and human mentation allow for an expansion of humankind? And he ran up in that fight against Isaac Newton, who tried to steal Leibniz's contribution that led to the calculus. And Newton, who insisted that Leibniz was nothing but an esoteric figure, whereas Newton was the real deal. So these kinds of fights have gone on for centuries. And they do go back to Plato and Aristotle. And so I encourage you to take a look at these kinds of issues. And you can find a lot of material on this at larouchepub.com. So thanks for joining me today, and I will see you again next week. Have a good weekend.